Hi, my name is Emerald. Welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm having a conversation with INFJ Sean all about the NITI loop.
I am here and ready to discuss.
All right, cool. What the NITI loop is basically you have your dominant function as an INFJ, which is an NI, which is the introverted intuition. And so basically what that does is that just gives you lots and lots of information. I kind of liken it to waves in the ocean, sort of like crashing into your mind. It doesn't like really work in a linear fashion. It just all comes at once, and it's just constantly picking up information both consciously and unconsciously from different places, internally and externally. Just it's all there. And then what the TI is, that's the auxiliary function. So it's our third most dominant trait, which is introverted thinking. And so this kind of puts things sort of in order, and that's how they optimally work together. But what happens is that sometimes there becomes a loop, like where you bypass the extroverted feeling function, which is like the auxiliary function, which is more dominant than the thinking function, and gives a little bit more balance to that. What happens is that you just end up going back and forth between like all these intuitions coming and then trying to make sense of it, and then it kind of coming to more questions, more intuitions coming in. So it creates this looping effect where you can't really get anything resolved, and you can kind of get sort of stuck in your own ways and stuck in your own head if you can't find ways to reconcile that loop. So that's basically what it is. And personally, I've experienced this a lot. Have you?
Yes and no, actually. That's really awesome. I like the description, generally speaking, about what it is. It's a new concept for me, but I have experienced it. I just didn't have a label to kind of associate it.
Yeah.
And I find that this particular loop kind of is just under the surface until you actually name it and know exactly what it is and what your cognitive functions are and what they do. It's rather difficult to actually know what's happening and why. And I first heard about it, I was on a Skype call with another INFJ friend the other night, and she brought it up and mentioned it to me. I was like, oh, that's interesting, and I did my own research on it. And immediately, during the research, during the description, which I was reading, similar to the one you just gave, I got a metaphor too, but it wasn't waves crashing. It was kind of like an evolutionary thing where it's like you have gatherers and you have organizers. And for me, NI is like a gatherer where it goes out and it pulls back all these cool things. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is a cool idea, and you could do this. And what about this? And then the TI inside that tertiary function is like the organizer going, okay, you're bringing me these things. Clearly, these thoughts go over in this folder, and these go here. And it's really interesting to see their interactions, especially since they're inside your own head. And that was my first initial kind of understanding.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. I really like that. So like I kind of think of it as like, oh, this ocean's coming. Let's organize everything that comes out of the ocean, like all the shells that kind of wash up on the shore.
That's pretty good too. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it would make sense because the ocean is so wide and so broad, and NI being the dominant would bring in so many things. Would that make the TI a beachcomber?
I think so. Yeah, and so what I've experienced a lot when it comes to this NITI loop, and like I actually have like a really, I would call it like a bad habit that sometimes turns into something good, like because a lot of times I'll come up with very creative ideas when doing this. I have a bad habit of pacing and sort of like just constantly like trying to think of different things and reconcile things, and it like really takes me out of the more social aspects of life, sometimes getting stuck in that loop. But also at the same time, so many great ideas come from it because I can really be fully immersed in that intuition, and be kind of like withdrawn in that way. So on one hand, it's like there's a source of creativity there, but then on the other hand, it's like one of those things like, oh, I've been just sitting in my room all day just thinking about things constantly,
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting to see the interactions from dominant primary NI and tertiary TI. Just the amount of prevalence in your life is like so astounding because you're in your NI all the time. and you don't even think about
Oh
it.
yeah.
And I'm at the point in my life where so that I can almost put things into perspective, put things into order, and then hopefully act on them via my extroverted cognitive functions. But you never know.
All right. So I would say, how does your NI and TI work together? I know that you'd mentioned the metaphor, but like, do you have any other examples of how that those two things go together for you?
Tons and tons. And I'll be sure and parrot the question back to you here in a minute because I want to hear your reflections as well. But the more I think about it, the more it's a deal where my NI brings stuff in, like I said, and the TI checks it and almost questions the reality of it, the tangibleness of it, and even if it can truly understand it, it still has to organize it and prioritize it and put it somewhere. And my mind especially thinks that organizing it and putting it in a certain location will solve it, when really there's a whole another world beyond that in terms of action and making it happen. I liken it to an author versus a publisher. The author has these great ideas, and the publisher has to bring it into being. And TI
Yeah,
doesn't always do that very well. Exactly. So that's just one example. How about for you? Do you have anything in mind, really?
yeah, personally for me, like, because I started taking art classes when I was in high school, and then I went on to major in art in college, and this was actually very, very helpful for me because basically I could kind of come up with some basic rules, so to speak, for my creation that I could sort of organize all of the intuitive information that was coming. So, like, let's say, for example, like instead of just coming at it like, oh, I'm going to create this and 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 having like unlimited possibilities, if I took that TI and I said, okay, I want just these things, I want to explore these particular ideas, how do I channel all that intuition into these particular ideas? And so I could get some really like good cohesive series work, and then also be able to really explore an idea in much greater depth than I normally would had I just gone from here to here to here intuitively.
Just out of curiosity, though, out of all your dealings with NI and with TI, and having lived with these functions for your entire life, do you find that you appreciate one more than the other, or that you're interested in one more than the other, or do you have any feelings or narratives associated with them to the point where it's almost like, oh, that's my NI interacting and I know exactly what that feels like? Do you have any kind of experiences to share with those?
Actually, even studying into this NI and TI differentiation really makes things a lot more clear, because I always kind of considered my NI and TI the same thing. Oh, I'm just thinking, you know? And so it's really good to be able to see that there's actually two functions going on there at once that I'm kind of like sort of grappling between. So I think that distinction is very, very helpful in itself. But I would say that if I'm to look at both separate from one another, I do prefer the NI because it's like unlimited possibilities. There's so much there that can be explored, and like basically it's very infinite, whereas the thinking function is very logical, and logical things by their own nature in order to be logical are very finite, and it's just a little bit less exciting to me.
Yeah. Good points. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks. What would you say out of the two of those is your favorite? So if you were to like say, if you had to pick only one, of course that would be disastrous, like to live off of for your entire life, which would it be?
Well, I'm really torn here because the older I grow, the more I want to be rooted in my TI, and the more it makes life a lot easier. But at the same time, life without NI would not be the life that I know it, and I really adore my NI because it's just a wonderful thing that provides me with an escape when I want it, companionship when I want it, whatever it might be. It's this almost like a television set that never turns off and covers every wall. It's the ultimate vision and the freedom to roam wherever I want to go. So to live without NI would really stink, it's not that I wouldn't want to do it. It would be a different experience. But if given the choice again, I would definitely want NI, either primary or tertiary or somewhere in the top tier of my functions because I just enjoy it so much. Do you have a preference?
Oh yeah. Yeah, like I would say that that's absolutely true for me. Like thinking is very, very useful. And I think it's because of the more limited nature, because basically in order to function out here in life, you have to be able to sort of limit your experiences because the nature of external experience is sort of limited in itself. So it helps you interface more with the world and it helps you to be able to express things better. And that was actually an issue that I've actually had with NI before, where it was basically like, up until I got somewhere in my teen years, like literally someone would say something to me or ask me a question, I really wouldn't be able to organize my thoughts quick enough. And so sometimes, like, I swear I would just come off sounding like a total like crazy person, which is actually probably why I'm somewhat nervous in this interaction. I'm like, oh, let's make sure all my thoughts stay organized, don't say crazy stuff. Yeah, so that was the thinking function I think is very, very helpful in terms of just organizing and interfacing with the world in a very practical way.
You know what's interesting?
What's that?
I find that I have never thought of my NI as a thinking function. I've never consciously said when I'm in NI, I'm just thinking about stuff. It's always
Oh,
been like a daydream to me. It's always just been, I don't even consciously like say, well, sometimes you do. You say, hey, this is a terrible situation. I want to escape, turn it on. But really, for me, it's more along the lines of I'm not thinking. I'm just kind of flowing. Whatever I feel, whatever I want to pursue, wherever I want to be, I'm instantly either there or on my way, depending on how many like social distractions I have going on around me. So it's cool that you classify it as a thinking function because I believe it technically is. But to me, I've never thought of it that way. Any comments?
yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. I think I just didn't really make a distinction between the two. Like I always just thought, oh, I'm just thinking, but I kind of thought of the flowing aspect of it as thinking. But yeah, totally. It's almost like it just kind of comes. Like it doesn't matter if I'm consciously trying to put it in motion or not. It just kind of hits me, and sometimes it's like it can very much sidetrack me from real world things. So it's like, oh, like this is an interesting scenario, or what if this, or what if that, or oh, this is a cool creative idea. So it's very, like I said, it has that like crashing over you kind of nature where it's like you don't really control it, but it's just there. It's like almost like a force of nature in itself.
Yeah. Now here's a cool quick subset before we get back on direct topic. I have a video about overthinking. A lot of people have touched on overthinking. When someone overthinks, do you think that's NI or TI or both? What do you think?
I think it's actually the NITI loop going on, because that's what I've experienced. Like in times when I've had like less things going on in my life, like because like whenever I've taken the Myers-Briggs in the past, my intuitive function is very, very polar from my sensation function. It's like in the 95%. So I'm always like very, very heavy in that. And so anytime where I've been kind of like where I have too much spare time on my hands or don't have a lot of responsibilities, I could literally just spend all day in my room, like, or, wherever, just thinking about different possibilities and not really engaging in life. So I would say that in terms of overthinking, that it's definitely that loop going on. I think it's like a little bit of both, where it's like trying to find ways to reconcile all of that content that's coming in from the NI. So I would say maybe more TI, maybe it's more like relying on that tertiary function. But really, I think it's the interplay between the two of those more so.
Yeah, initially that was my thought too, but the more I think about it now and over the past few days, I've been more inclined to think TI because I feel like NI can at least kind of counter itself where it's like jumping around from possibilities, but there are both good and bad possibilities. Whereas with TI, I feel like I stray towards these are the consequences, this is what's going to happen. Not only can I see down the path, but I can see the consequences along the line associated with that path. So that's why I suspect, but I can't really assert yet.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting trying to differentiate like the more of like the worrying aspect, because I'm not sure if that actually comes from NI or not. NI tends to be the creative aspect, but I guess in a way, when you worry about future scenarios, you're also kind of creating. But I kind of think of like the worrying aspect more like a thinking thing too. So it is hard to tell.
Well, I feel like NI is a little bit of how things should be, the idealism in life. So it would be disappointing when that isn't met.
Oh
But
yeah.
at the same time, TI for me is more the order things should be in. So I'm just going in a loop at this point. But thanks for answering the question. That was a good answer.
Thanks. Let me find a way to put this. I'm gonna like try to talk a little bit about how there's the NI, the FE, the TI, and then the SE, which is the inferior function. Like, do you find that, let's say, if you are stuck in the NI-TI loop, do you find it easy to go more toward the FE, like with the extroverted feeling, or more easy to, let's say, do the extroverted sensing aspect where you're actually like looking at things? So like if you're trying to actually break yourself out of that pattern, which do you find more helpful or easier for you to do?
I feel like if I'm trying to break my loop, someone has alerted me to the fact that I'm in the NITI loop, because when you're in it, it's so hard to break out of it. It's just a rut that's so deep and your car just won't turn. So
Yeah.
yeah, and that's where I think SE is more likely to help me break out of it. Just simply go do something about it. FE motivational factors in my life aren't always the happiest because you feel obligated because of the relationship or the way things should be. It ties in with my NI and the idealism there, but I find SE is a little easier. Not to say that it's easy at all to break out of that loop. It is not. But if I had to give you a percentage, I'd say more than half of the time it's because SE says, hey, just go try it. You never know. See what happens. See how you feel afterwards. And it kind of ties in with, in my research, I was finding examples of this loop, as in you like someone, you don't know how to talk to someone, they give you an implication, you review it, you know, this is the classic kind of scenario, and then usually you go to SE just going and asking them, or maybe not right away. There's a long, tedious debate there in your own head about the idealism saying, yeah, definitely, there were signs there, and then the TI saying, logically, this is what they were. Any comments on your end?
Yeah, I would say for me, SE is a bit easier, although sometimes it's really not enough just to break out. But if I could find that if I can focus on something like mindfully, like in my environment, like just around me, and like try to like bring myself out of it by saying, okay, let's ground myself in the situation. I have a computer here, my bed is here, okay, this is there, you know, and trying to be like mindful of the actual present moment, sort of almost like meditation. I find that that's a little bit, I guess, less emotionally difficult to do than actually going out there and engaging in the FE aspects, because like you said, it's like some things are just not quite as easy to do, because a lot of times I find that a lot of people don't quite understand me. I think there's always that sort of being misunderstood from the INFJ perspective, because it is such a rare personality type. It's hard to find somebody who really kind of gets it in that way. But at the same time, I do have some friends, and my husband's really good for that. But I find that if I have to actually go out and meet somebody new, like there's maybe about a 75% chance that the interaction isn't going to be like an interaction where I can truly break out into an actual interaction with them that's genuine and deep. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. And just out of curiosity, you only recently, or I would guess in the last couple of years, figured out what this loop is, how it applies to you, all that stuff. What was life like before you had that awareness of the existence of the NITI loop? And did you ever try and explain it to anyone or try and figure it out on your own? What was that like?
I always just thought that, oh gosh, I just have this compulsion and it's just a weird thing that I have. You know, I didn't really think that it was like an actual personality type thing, because like I said, I've hardly ever met anybody who has a similar personality to me. And so, like I said, I have this habit of just pacing around and going around and around in my head. And it's always been the case ever since I was a little kid. So I just thought, oh, this is just kind of a weird thing that I do and that other people don't do, you know, but being able to see this, it really puts that habit into context, like why I have to do that in a way, you know, like why it is that it becomes like a constant going round and round in my head, so it was relieving to find that information. I don't know, maybe it was a year ago that I started looking into this. And so basically it just kind of gave me an explanation for what was already there.
Nice. For me, growing up, I realized something was different in a sense that I thought about stuff a little intuitive around my surroundings. And looking back, it was kind of a trigger point for me for those rare occasions when I wasn't in high spirits and overly optimistic about stuff. Because I always thought, this is what depression must feel like, this is what true sadness must feel like, whatever. But really, for me, it was just overload in terms of TI thought and too many potential situations through NI, and I titled that Thought Storm, because everything's going on in your head. It's all twisting, it's all turning, it's a terrible thing to behold, but no one can see it. And when you're a kid, you don't necessarily have the ability to express that, so those were the times when my parents could probably attest to me being really quiet and just not talking to anyone, like really not talking to anyone.
Oh yeah, I was not very talkative as a child either. I always kind of kept to myself. And I'll always, like when I was a little kid, when I had a little bit less of a grasp on it, and when it was really like, oh my gosh, how do I even handle this? I would often like have like a lot of social anxiety, and I still have like a degree of it, but when I was a child, like it was really like, ooh, I don't want to talk to people because there's going to be like this misunderstanding because I have all this weird stuff going on in my head. So it was always this feeling like, oh, I have all of this going on in the internal world that I cannot bring out. And I guess it makes sense to have that as a child because you are a lot less able to communicate what's going on inside because you just don't have the vocabulary and you're not really so well versed in yourself that you can actually make other people understand you yet.
Yeah, and I suspect people with the exact inverse cognitive functions, like ENFPs, who have the NE-TE loop, I'm sure there's something similar for them. I can't speak for them, of course, but my guess is it would be something like they see something in their external world that ought to be a certain way because of their idealism, and then they either can't change it or people don't respect it or something. I have to do my own research in that area, but I'm sure there's a flip side to this whole topic. At least, maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Actually, I was looking up videos in relation to the NITI loop, and apparently there's this thing where it's just the dominant tertiary loop, so like basically like bypassing that secondary auxiliary function and going back and forth. So it would be interesting to see how that works in other people.
Yeah, either staying too internal or too external.
Yeah. So, and I think that was like one of the explanations that was given is that whenever you bypass the secondary, because since it rotates between internal, external, so we have internal intuition, extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and then extroverted sensing. So since it alternates back and forth, basically you're not balancing out between the internal and external. So it's kind of like a being trapped internally. So maybe some people get trapped externally where they really can't go inward, where it just is like, oh, this thing. So it is interesting. I'll have to look into it myself too.
Just out of curiosity, now that you're of a certain age and you know what this kind of loop function is, how do you deal with it in your current life, and what kind of do you want to gain from interacting with it?
Well, one thing that I find is that if I have an outlet to express some of that, it actually like kind of calms it down a little bit. Like if I go a while without making anything like artwork or like the videos that I make now, or basically I sort of start to feel like almost engorged on all of this intuitive information where it's like, oh, I have all this internal stuff and nobody knows it. And so like nobody knows me, and I get into that. But as long as I'm putting stuff out there and I can feel like people are seeing what I'm having to say and like, oh, I understand that, or I at least see that, it feels like part of me is getting expressed, and it kind of calms down the chatter inside actually a little bit. So I would say that's how I deal with it now. How about yourself?
I wish I had an answer as clear cut as that. Acknowledgement for me first and foremost, realizing that I'm in it, trying to diagnose how to best take care of it, be it sleep or talking with someone else. But I find it's like hot and cold. I either want one of the two extremes to help solve it. Either I need to express it and be felt, or talk to someone and have them kind of validate the NI aspects of it, or actually I'm not even on that journey yet, or the exact opposite, where I just need complete peace and quiet to myself. I mean, it really varies on a spectrum from hot to cold. And as embarrassing as that is to say, it's just kind of, you do what you have to do to get by it. The main thing is acknowledging that you're in it and then doing what you have to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with the loop, it is so hard to get yourself out of it, because like that thinking function can like totally like rationalize why this is a good thing. Like, oh yeah, I'll just do this for another little bit and then I'll do something else. Or so it kind of like sidetracks you from what you're supposed to do, to actually go and engage with the world, or do whatever's necessary in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you ever think, when trying to explain this to people, they're not getting it, or it's not worth getting it? And then even so, do you ever feel like there are any misrepresentations or misinterpretations from other people when they see you going through it?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've always been kind of called a space cadet, because I daydream a lot, and I'm always in that NI state. And so I think a lot of people tend to interpret that as like, I don't care about things going on in the world, or that, so it's basically like, if people translate it as me being like incredibly sort of go with the flow, like I don't mind what happens. And so like a lot of times, because I also have a very calm sort of mannerism too, and so I think a lot of times just being able to explain that, hey, I actually do care about these things, I just express myself in a little bit of a different way, has a tendency maybe to not register with a lot of people. Like I know that like with my husband, and he's an ENFJ, whenever he cares about something, he really expresses his emotions in a very strong way on the outside. Like if he's angry, he's angry. If he's happy, he's happy. Whereas for me, like I'm very, very calm, because everything goes on internally for me. And so a lot of times I might seem like more aloof, or like, oh yeah, whatever, when I really actually do care about something. I do think it tends to miss a lot of people who are used to expressing in strong ways their emotions externally.
I always feel like socially I'm good at hiding my emotions, although it's not always the case. I feel like if it's severe enough, there's no way to properly hide it. And I'm kind of convincing myself slowly that I'm either driving my friends crazy, or just slowly inducting people into my life, where when they meet me, it's the social side, it's the more straightforward side. Everything seems to be in order. Oh, this guy's got his stuff together. And then the more you realize that because I'm in my own head and in my own intuition so much, I am totally aloof when it comes to various situations, settings, little things. And that's where I really value my connections with INTJs. Like my sister's an INTJ, one of my closest friends is an INTJ, and they're just so on the ball in regards to external order. And it's like, wow, you have processes and procedures for everything. It's just so cool to see them happening.
I get so jealous of people that are like that, because that's what I lack. For me, I've been trying to implement this thing called Keystone Habits. Basically, it's where you create like one habit that you do relating to basic like physiological fundamentals, like nutrition, sleep, exercise, and that way you do those things early on in the day, and then hopefully it sets you up for a more organized and productive day, because that's what I really need. Like I need a structure to be able to like organize my day in a way that's efficient. Otherwise I'll just be like, oh, let me just think for a while, like just being a space cadet. And so like I find that that's actually very, very helpful for me if I can start out my day like that, and I can think, okay, what am I supposed to be doing? Let me create to-do lists. And I think that's the J function really coming into play. And even though I'm pretty close with my J and my P, I think like I always think that I'm at my best self when I'm more toward the J side, because I need that external hook to keep me engaged with the practical things of life, especially being a parent. So basically, when it comes to engaging with the practical tasks of life that maybe aren't quite as interesting as the intuitive function, like how do you, what are some ways that you use to actually break yourself out and to get engaged with the practical things of life that are just not as interesting as, you know, the more creative, intuitive side.
Well, I definitely try and use my intuition to predict a pattern in the external environment, although it's not intended to do so. It's more like, you know, trying to look through swimming goggles when you're outside in the real world. It just kind of distorts things a little bit. And
oh yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. I always feel kind of sad when I fail to properly follow a practice or a procedure perfectly. It's like, man, if I had just known, or if the person who had explained it to me had said it in a way that I could fully understand, this wouldn't be an issue. And it's tough because initially all the thoughts resonate with me. So if I can create the system from start, you know, it's my kind of creation. I know the ins and outs of it. But when it comes in from an external source, not quite as strong, not quite as fluent, and I know how difficult it is for me to learn something like that. The problem is I'm not kind of open enough to communicate, hey, listen, this will take me some time to learn. It's not incompetency, it's just a continual time investment to learn a procedure that was developed outside of my kind of consciousness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense a lot. Like, I think for me, you know, if I'm having to adapt some kind of process or something, it's always difficult for me to actually practically apply it to my own life, because I find that because of the intuitive function, like, it kind of like tends to idealize things a lot. Like, oh, once I do this, things are going to be this way and this way and this way, and then it's like, you know, if I go into it with that, there's going to be this disappointment because what works for that one person in a particular way might not work for me in that same particular way. And so at this point, you know, I start to see, okay, you know, don't expect too much from this. Let's just see what happens. You know, so kind of like going back to that SE, let's see what happens, you know. And so I guess that's kind of how I deal with that now. But I know that in the past, that's sort of like, oh, here's the ideal, and a disappointment when it doesn't quite happen, and feeling like, oh, beating myself up because I'm not perfectly matching up to this particular thing.
Yeah, good point. The question I would have to kind of summarize and bring it back, and I that both of us acknowledge it and are very aware of its existence. How do you not deal with it, but how do you want to approach it moving forward? From, of course, an idealistic standpoint, what is the way you plan on dealing with it from here on out?
I think, you know, if I'm able to compartmentalize it to particular times during the day, like, I think that would probably be the healthiest expression of it. And I think with that Keystone Habits things that I had mentioned, and other things that get me engaged with the practical tasks of life and keep me, you know, more in the external world, like, as long as I can go back and forth between those two states, and it doesn't just become like, oh, the intuition is my comfort zone and I'm only staying in my intuition, you know, as long as I'm balancing things out, like, I can take insights from my intuition and then I can bring them into the external world and then kind of organize them with the J function and really make them into something that's real and tangible. Because, like, my thing is, like, when I would get stuck in the NITI loop, you know, I'd get all these great insights from my intuition that, like, afterward I'd be like, oh, I didn't write any of this down. I just spent time thinking about it, you know, because I just didn't want to do the external function along with it. I wanted to stay in the thinking and the intuitive process. And so it's like, oh, well, I don't remember any of it now, you know, or I might remember some of it, but I didn't write it down, so it wasn't perfect. But, oh, if I had written it down, it would be great. And so I think, you know, just making time to actually get those things expressed that want to be expressed, and then also, you know, just not feeling bad when I go into that again, because I know that it's going to happen. It's part of who I am. So just making sure that all my time doesn't get sucked up with it. How about you?
Okay. Well, for me, it's interesting because I have no trouble acknowledging when I'm in it and recognizing it relatively quickly. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a couple kind of like safeguards where when I'm in it, I want to do one of these things. I really just want to refine those practices and figure out where the connection lies. You know, if I'm in this NITI loop because of a certain thing, I want to know what action will help me alleviate it and get away from it as soon as possible, break out of that rut, so to say. So that's really where my focus is going to be here for the next couple, I don't know, months, years, whatever it might be. Because I don't like being in that rut. Sometimes I wallow in it a little bit because it makes good art.
Yeah.
But really, I don't think it's the healthiest place to be. So I'm looking forward to just getting better at dealing with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like there was one video that I was watching that was describing the NITI loop, where it was basically saying that it's caused by like basically missing pieces in the puzzle, like because the TI is looking for ways to make connections between all of the intuitive information. And so there are some places where there are just gaps. And so like maybe going forward and figuring out how to fill in those gaps for like questions you might be consciously having or unconsciously having, and just becoming really, really aware of what those are so that you can find that external piece of information that'll kind of satisfy that thing. So let's say, for example, you're having trouble understanding why a particular emotion keeps coming up for you. Like let's say that, oh, you're having chronic sadness when it comes to thinking about a particular thing, and then basically finding some piece of external information that sort of explains why that is to satisfy the thinking function, so that it's like, oh, that's why, and then you can come up with new solutions from there and maybe not have to deal with that particular issue and not have to think about it in the NITI loop.
Hey, that's a really good thought. Props to you. That's neat.
Thanks.
The more I think about it just now, in this kind of present moment, the more I wonder if utilizing FE and SE, I mean, SE is like 5%, but still, if you can use those in the moments, like the steps before you enter that NITI loop, I wonder if that would help, almost to the degree where a really well-versed and experienced INFJ would be able to say, okay, I'm in a social situation where if I don't do something about it, I'll wonder about it later. You know, I'll think about the logical aspects of it later, and I'll also wonder because there was, you know, some intuitiveness there that I connected with. So I think it's important in those moments to either kick yourself in the pants via SE and do something about it, or use your FE to kind of properly make a connection with whoever or whatever is going on in the social situation. That's just my quick kind of, I think this might help summary.
Yeah, I think so. And I think especially engaging the FE, even though it's like uncomfortable, you know, because basically being an introvert, you know, and then having to engage in the FE, there's a discomfort there. There's a friction between those two things, even though those are like the dominant functions going on. And so I think that that's really good, because oftentimes I end up in social situations and like, oh, you know, is this person not understanding, or am I coming off as like this way or that way? And then, you know, trying to pick up on like, you know, how they're feeling about something I may have said, or, you know, what if they misunderstood this and they thought it meant this and then they felt this way? And I tend to get really caught up in thoughts like that. And that type of NITI loop just has there's no benefit to that one. You know, like when I get into the intuitive aspects, like where I can actually come up with new creative ideas, like that's fun. But this type of thinking is like very, very circular and can never be reconciled. And, you know, it's just like, oh, did I totally bomb that social situation? So I think, yeah, going to that FE especially is very, very important, because then when you can kind of laugh at yourself and actually make a real connection and not really have to worry, oh, did I do this social interaction exactly the right way that I was supposed to? And like, hey, you know, this person and I, you know, we clicked or we didn't click, and that's fine.
Yeah, well said. That's about all I had on the topic. Do you have anything else?
Nothing off the top of my head, but thank you for having this video interaction with me. And if you're interested in more content like this, anything about spirituality, psychology, you know, anything about like the subterranean human experience, then go ahead and subscribe to my channel. That's the Diamond Net.
And if you want to see more reflections and different almost opinions from me, you can check out my channel, INFJ Sean.
So thank you for talking with me. Like, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think like I got a lot of great insights from you, and it's always great to be able to talk to another INFJ who really gets the same kind of thing, who's dealt with the NITI loop, which can be so beguiling. And yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Emerald. This was a lot of fun. Great use of beguiling, and thanks for having me on your channel. Should do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, most definitely. All right, see you later.
Later.
Bye.